Today, October 24, Russia's sense of territorial invulnerability shattered in a single hour. In the early morning, an explosion rocked one of the country's most critical energy assets, a major gas processing facility near the Kazakh border in Orenburg. The strike was sudden, precise, and, according to early assessments, deliberate. Initial statements from regional authorities described it as a technical incident. But by midday, evidence had mounted too quickly, and silence gave way to anxiety. This was no accident. It was a coordinated, high-impact attack, and it happened hundreds of kilometers inside Russian territory. For years, Moscow projected strength through energy, pipelines, terminals, storage hubs, all engineered not just to fuel economies, but to fortify the image of a state untouchable within its own borders. That image no longer holds. Satellite imagery reviewed by international analysts confirmed structural damage to the main compression infrastructure, with a secondary fire engulfing parts of the pipeline junction facility. Plumes of smoke towered above the steppe as regional transport routes were locked down without explanation. Civilian flights in and out of Orenburg were delayed or rerouted. Official messaging remained minimal. But the reaction on the ground told its own story: emergency units deployed, airspace partially closed, and armed personnel guarding transit roads leading to the site. Inside Moscow, panic didn't erupt in the streets, it spread through the corridors of power. According to multiple insider accounts, at least 3 emergency briefings were held behind closed doors between the early morning and midday. The participants, energy ministry officials, military liaisons, and internal security advisors. One phrase reportedly appeared in the classified bulletins circulated after the first meeting: strategic depth compromised. In other words, the assumption that Russia could wage war abroad while maintaining domestic calm has now been decisively broken. The timing could not have been more symbolic, or more damaging. Orenburg, sitting close to the Kazakh border, is not just a logistical node. It is a perception marker, a red line in the collective psyche. This facility lies deep within what Moscow has long regarded as its interior safe zone, far from the war's visible front lines. And yet, this morning, the war came anyway. Not through statements or ideology, but through shock, flame, and the quiet horror of a system unprepared to absorb the blow. And now, as the smoke still rises over the steppe, a deeper, more difficult question is beginning to circulate within the walls of government buildings and private group chats alike: if Orenburg can be hit, what else is already within reach? By the time the first official statement was issued, a short, clinically worded bulletin from the regional administration citing a malfunction at an industrial site, the scale of the damage had already outgrown the cover story. Independent monitors tracking seismic activity detected a sharp, localized shockwave at precisely 4:36 a.m. local time, followed by a secondary tremor minutes later. Not the signature of an internal accident. The pattern was consistent with a deliberate strike. And as dawn spread across the Orenburg Oblast, locals near the village of Ilek began uploading footage too visceral to dismiss: a distant roar, then a flash, then rising smoke behind high fencing, far beyond any civilian zone. Within hours, Russian social media platforms entered suppression mode. Keywords linked to the gas facility were shadow banned, and dozens of regional telegram channels reporting from the scene were abruptly shut down. Yet the information continued to leak. Screenshots of internal emergency communications appeared in private group chats, showing directives issued by the Ministry of Energy to halt all downstream transfers through the Orenburg pipeline hub. Simultaneously, gas export schedules were quietly amended. Delivery delays to several domestic processing plants were logged, while international volumes, especially those routed through Kazakhstan, were flagged for revision. This was not a self-contained crisis. It was the slow-motion failure of a strategic artery. Experts in energy infrastructure quickly identified the target: the Orenburg gas processing plant, a key component in Russia's southern energy grid and a crucial node in its gas export system. More than just a refinery, this complex handles separation, compression, and directional flow for multiple pipelines feeding into Europe, Central Asia, and domestic industrial zones. And now, for the first time in its operational history, it had gone completely offline. Not slowed. Not compromised. Shut down. Satellite imagery reviewed by Western intelligence agencies showed visible structural damage to core installations, including flare stacks and pressurization units. More tellingly, scorched impact zones indicated that the strike had bypassed perimeter defenses and struck with surgical precision. According to one senior European energy consultant, this wasn't random shelling. Whoever hit it knew exactly where the bottlenecks were, and made sure they ruptured. Inside Moscow, this assessment hit like a slow-burning fuse. According to internal memos viewed by independent analysts, Key ministries were advised to avoid premature attribution, a bureaucratic euphemism for, "We don't know how this happened, and we're afraid of what the answer might be." What's worse, early risk models presented to the Security Council projected that a second strike on a facility of similar importance could cripple entire supply corridors for a minimum of 7 days, an unacceptable disruption not only for military logistics, but for civilian infrastructure already strained by sanctions and economic isolation. And this is where the panic quietly metastasized, not on television screens or in the streets, but behind the scenes, where systems are supposed to be protected by distance and routine. What shook insiders wasn't just the damage itself. It was what it implied, a level of penetration no longer limited to border areas or occupied territories, but deep into the Russian interior. For years, strategic depth, the vastness of Russian geography, has served as a psychological shield. Even in the face of losses abroad, Moscow could always retreat into the comfort of distance. Orenburg shattered that assumption. It proved that geography no longer guarantees safety. That the war, until now something projected outward, has turned and begun to flow back in. This shift was felt instantly within the economic sector. Several commodity trading platforms paused energy-related futures contracts involving Orenburg-linked supply chains. Export clients began contacting intermediaries for updated delivery guarantees. At least 2 Central Asian transport companies halted pipeline maintenance operations in southern Russia, citing insurance ambiguities. These responses were not coordinated. They were instinctual, the market reacting faster than the state could respond. And still, the official line held. Kremlin-affiliated media outlets carried on with routine programming, slipping vague phrases like unforeseen delays into regional energy reports, while downplaying disruptions as routine safety evaluations. But those watching closely could see the fear. Not in words, but in absence. No statements from the Ministry of Defense. No updates from Gazprom. No speeches, no visits, no promises of retaliation. The entire state machinery appeared paralyzed, unsure whether acknowledging the strike would expose its own inability to prevent another. On the ground in Orenburg, the reality was already undeniable. Roads near the blast zone remained blocked. Civilian access to key intersections was restricted without official explanation. Mobile signal strength dropped near the perimeter, a sign that counter-surveillance protocols were in effect. Gas prices in nearby towns spiked by midday. In Orsk and Buzaluk, pharmacies reported shortages of basic supplies. And in the absence of any coherent narrative from above, the rumors filled the gap: drone swarms, saboteurs, foreign special forces. Each new version more surreal than the last, but each pointing toward the same collective conclusion: something got in. And in systems built on denial, the mere idea that something got in becomes more destabilizing than any material loss. What's happening now in the quiet panic rooms of Moscow is not just response planning, it's recalibration. A state that once believed in secure perimeters and deep reserves is now confronting a new kind of threat: precision, patience, and reach. Whoever orchestrated this strike didn't just hit a gas plant. They sent a message through fire and absence. And that message is now being read, not just in Orenburg, but in every ministry hallway, every logistics center, and every office tasked with keeping the Russian home front intact. Because if this was the first, there's only one question left: how many more are coming? By the early afternoon, the tremors from the Orenburg strike had begun to reshape not only Russia's energy landscape, but the internal architecture of its security apparatus. In ministries, in military logistics rooms, and across the executive tiers of state-connected corporations, the unspoken consensus was clear: this was not just a tactical incident. It was a signal event, precise, symbolic, and destabilizing. And now, it was producing aftershocks in places no missile had touched. The most immediate concern was not reconstruction, but comprehension. How, insiders demanded, could such a well-defended site, positioned hundreds of kilometers from any active frontline, have been penetrated without warning? The Orenburg gas processing complex is not an isolated rural facility. It is integrated into a web of critical infrastructure nodes, protected by physical perimeters, technical surveillance systems, and layers of jurisdictional oversight involving both state and private security contractors. Yet this morning, all of that proved meaningless. Not only was the strike successful, it was undetected until it was already over. That fact alone sent shockwaves through the upper echelons of Russia's military-industrial elite. Preliminary findings from a confidential interministerial review, never meant to reach the public, reportedly concluded that the most likely vector of the attack involved either an aerial delivery system operating below current detection thresholds or an internal technical compromise. Neither conclusion offered comfort. One suggests that Russia's layered air defense systems are functionally obsolete against modern low-signature weapons. The other points to the possibility of infiltration, sabotage, or even embedded coordination within the facility's operations team. In both cases, the message is catastrophic: control is no longer assured. And it is this loss of control, not the flames, not the damaged pipelines, that has begun to break the Kremlin's strategic rhythm. According to sources close to the National Security Council, a sudden wave of late-morning containment protocols were triggered across 5 federal districts, including Volga, Ural, and Siberian regions. These protocols, developed during the Cold War but rarely activated, grant regional administrators expanded authority to curtail information flows, isolate communications nodes, and secure transit corridors deemed vulnerable to secondary pressure incidents. No such incidents had occurred yet, but the machinery of fear was already turning. In parallel, the intelligence community went into isolation mode. Electronic surveillance bases in the southern military district began cycling encryption keys more frequently than usual. Aerial patrol frequencies over the Caspian region were updated. Reports emerged of special reconnaissance units being dispatched not outward, but inward, into the infrastructure zones of Orenburg, Samara, and Astrakhan. Their task was not to find enemies. It was to locate cracks, gaps, vulnerabilities, and, as one analyst put it, to map how the invisible came in. What made the moment more volatile was the complete lack of a visible adversary. There was no claimed responsibility. No broadcast video of launch teams. No militant group seeking attention. Just silence, followed by fire, followed by silence again. For a system that thrives on narrative, on identifying threats and naming enemies, this was strategic suffocation. Without a target to retaliate against, power had no direction. And in a country that has built its geopolitical posture on the performance of dominance, directionless power is indistinguishable from weakness. In Moscow's economic circles, the implications were just as severe. While public markets remained relatively stable, thanks in part to government intervention, behind closed doors, high-level discussions turned openly pessimistic. Several investment banks operating under state charters temporarily froze energy-linked assets in their portfolios. Analysts at the Russian Direct Investment Fund were instructed to prepare revised risk models for domestic infrastructure projects previously classified as Tier 1 secure. One internal memo, not yet publicly acknowledged, warned that confidence in long-range logistics cannot be assumed under current threat parameters. This recalibration extended into civilian infrastructure as well. Major transportation hubs in Kazan, Chelyabinsk, and Ufa quietly revised fuel delivery schedules. At least 3 regional airports introduced temporary restrictions on non-military drone operations, even in recreational zones. Mobile communication providers in the affected regions reported increased latency, coinciding with the activation of signal suppression systems typically used only during counterterrorism drills. No public alerts were issued, but those who knew what to look for could see the shape of a system preparing for more. And beneath this institutional maneuvering, a darker shift was unfolding, one measured not in policy, but in sentiment. For years, the Russian population has lived with the distant drumbeat of war, told again and again that the state's vast geography and hardened infrastructure would protect them from the chaos seen in border regions. That illusion was functional, if not entirely honest. But now, as images of a burning facility deep in Orenburg circulated in private chats and underground media outlets, the psychological terrain began to erode. In towns far from the blast site, in Nizhny Novgorod, in Kurgan, in Penza, residents quietly began asking the same questions: what else can be hit? What else isn't safe? Gas stations in several rural districts experienced brief surges in demand, as rumors of fuel interruptions spread faster than any official response. In Moscow, VPN usage rose sharply throughout the day, as citizens attempted to verify rumors blocked on domestic search engines. And on Telegram, the dominant sentiment among previously neutral users shifted from confusion to something colder: distrust. This isn't protest. It isn't defiance. It's something harder to detect, but more corrosive over time: a quiet emotional decoupling from the state's promises. The most devastating attacks are those that don't just destroy assets, but rewrite assumptions. And today, the most sacred assumption of Russian statecraft, that the homeland is too deep, too distant, too hardened to be touched, has been permanently broken. And so the question is no longer just tactical. It's existential. If a state can't protect its core, not its borders, not its fronts, but its heart, then what, exactly, remains beyond reach? And if the war has come this far in, how far in will it go? As the day progressed, it became increasingly clear that the Orenburg strike was not an isolated event but the opening chapter of a new, disorienting phase in the conflict, a phase in which the map of the war is no longer confined to contested borders or proxy zones, but extends into the very center of Russia's institutional nerve system. The explosion may have occurred in a remote industrial region near the Kazakh frontier, but its psychological blast radius has already reached Moscow's command centers, economic core, and information architecture. The shock is no longer tactical. It is systemic. Inside the Ministry of Emergency Situations, reports continued to arrive throughout the day that painted a picture of layered disruption, not just a single detonation, but a ripple effect striking the spine of the region's energy infrastructure. Several secondary pipeline branches feeding into the Orenburg complex were manually depressurized, while smaller satellite stations operating under Gazprom's subsidiary control were quietly placed into emergency standby mode. One internal alert, flagged for senior access only, warned of potential cascading failures in the western Siberian grid if pressure recalibration was not completed within a 48-hour window. The reason wasn't structural damage. It was human hesitation. Local operators, spooked by the strike and operating without clear instructions from the center, had begun delaying routine technical resets, afraid that what happened in Orenburg could happen anywhere, at any time. This atmosphere of operational paralysis spread rapidly into the ranks of mid-level management across the state energy sector. Engineers and logistics coordinators, once considered the invisible backbone of Russian resource dominance, found themselves trapped between contradictory orders. On the one hand, they were told to maintain throughput and stability; on the other, they were advised to increase redundancy and exercise discretion, bureaucratic language hinting at risk of further disruption. A director of one gas compression facility in the Saratov region reportedly refused to sign off on a scheduled increase in capacity, citing unacceptable exposure. He wasn't reprimanded. He was quietly transferred. That silence spoke louder than punishment. Within the private sector, especially among those companies still tethered to state contracts but struggling to survive under sanctions, the message was unmistakable: the war had changed shape. And with it, the rules of engagement inside Russia itself. Insurance brokers in the energy corridor began pulling back from policies covering physical assets in extended risk zones, a vague designation that now seemed to include almost anything east of the Volga. Industrial warehouse providers halted shipments of replacement components. One Moscow-based supplier of high-pressure pipeline fittings informed clients via encrypted message that field-level inventory restocking is suspended pending review of new exposure models. In simple terms, the rear is no longer the rear. It's the new frontline. But the most consequential shift occurred where it was least expected, in the soft underbelly of Russian internal governance, the regional administrations. Normally sidelined, their role limited to rubber-stamping federal policy and managing local infrastructure, regional governors were suddenly confronted with a terrifying void, not only in information, but in leadership. According to verified leaks from a closed governors' conference call hosted by the presidential plenipotentiary for the Volga Federal District, at least 4 governors expressed direct concern over inconsistent instructions, absence of national messaging, and the risk of public demoralization if silence continues. What emerged from that call was not a plan, but a plea. Regional leaders asked for permission to issue their own statements, to calm local populations, to regain at least partial narrative control. They were denied. In response, several governors acted anyway. Not through bold public defiance, but in subtle, careful deviations from the script. The governor of Orenburg gave a brief local interview in which he acknowledged unusual kinetic activity and external technical influence, phrasing that, while vague, departed sharply from the official narrative of an internal malfunction. Elsewhere, municipal websites in Samara and Astrakhan temporarily posted energy rationing notices, only to remove them hours later after calls from Moscow. But the digital traces remained. Screenshots spread. And the public, long accustomed to decoding the subtext of state language, understood exactly what was being said. As this institutional dissonance deepened, another axis of fragility began to show strain: public compliance. While no protests emerged, and likely won't, given the current legal climate, signs of emotional rupture became harder to suppress. In Orenburg, lines at fuel stations extended into residential areas. Pharmacies reported sudden runs on iodine, painkillers, and power banks. Not because people expected immediate disaster, but because they no longer trusted that it wouldn't come. In Bashkortostan and Tatarstan, rumors spread of similar facilities being marked or next. Government censors scrambled to delete voice messages and local posts, but for every one they erased, 5 more appeared in private networks. The mood was no longer panic. It was anticipation, the kind that emerges when people stop believing that order is durable. And in this atmosphere of waiting, for answers, for action, for another strike, the state's core strength began to mutate into its greatest vulnerability, its obsession with silence. The longer officials withheld clarity, the more the void filled with speculation. Was it a drone swarm? Was it sabotage? Was it a warning from outside, or from within? Each unanswered question chipped away at a foundational assumption, that Moscow speaks, and the country follows. But what happens when Moscow has nothing to say? Foreign intelligence services, watching this play out in real time, saw a different pattern forming, not just technical breakdown or morale collapse, but informational fragmentation at scale. One European defense analyst described it as signal inversion. Where once the Kremlin set the tone and tempo, now it responds, late, inconsistently, and often through contradiction. Another Western official put it more bluntly, we're watching a regime fall behind its own crisis. Meanwhile, military planners were already drawing up contingency maps, not for offensive campaigns, but for triage. Which facilities can be protected? Which nodes can be sacrificed? Which routes can be trusted, and which may already be compromised? These are not decisions made in victory. They are calculations of survival. And each one brings the invisible battlefield further inland, closer to the centers of power that once imagined themselves immune. Because the war has changed direction. It no longer radiates outward. It is folding inward, into the very body of the state. And now the question whispered across Russia's command structure isn't when the next strike will come. It's how long the system can hold its breath before something, or someone, cracks. By the early evening of October 24th, the impact of the Orenburg strike could no longer be measured in terms of infrastructure alone. The damage to the gas processing plant, physical, visible, undeniable, was only the beginning. What followed was a slow, methodical unraveling of confidence that seeped into every level of Russian governance, from federal ministries to municipal offices, from state-aligned broadcasters to the exhausted civil servants monitoring call centers and emergency lines. The strike didn't just ignite pipelines. It triggered a chain reaction inside the very architecture of perceived control. The first and most profound casualty was informational coherence. Throughout the day, the Kremlin avoided issuing a single direct statement on the nature of the incident. Instead, federal news outlets were instructed to minimize focus on regional industrial disruptions, a euphemism that resulted in absurd programming choices, live broadcasts of pumpkin harvests in Tambov, museum openings in Kemerovo, and recycled economic forecasts from last quarter. But viewers were no longer passive. On platforms like VK and Telegram, once apathetic users began posting under official government pages with sarcastic tags like #TechnicalSmoke and #RoutineExplosions, mocking the absurdity of the silence. This dissonance was not lost on those inside the system. According to sources in the Kremlin's Media Coordination Office, at least 2 prominent state journalists refused to read government-approved copy on live television, prompting last-minute replacement with archival material. One long-serving anchor at Channel 1 reportedly walked off set after being told to ignore developments in Orenburg until guidance is received. In authoritarian information environments, control is not only enforced, it must be believed. And when the enforcers begin to question the logic of their own instructions, the structure begins to sway. Meanwhile, in ministries and command centers, the language of authority shifted from assertion to speculation. Leaked internal correspondence between senior officials in the Ministry of Industry and Trade shows a striking pattern: hesitancy, repeated use of conditional phrasing, repetitive disclaimers, an avoidance of definitive timelines for restoration or risk assessment. Pending verification, under review, awaiting confirmation. These aren't just bureaucratic habits. They are the linguistic fingerprints of a state struggling to maintain narrative supremacy over an event it no longer understands or controls. Inside the Federal Protective Service, which oversees the security of high-value assets and personnel, the operational posture underwent a quiet but telling recalibration. Protection details assigned to non-critical infrastructure in the Urals and Volga districts were rerouted toward energy and communications hubs. Certain vehicle convoys, typically reserved for classified material transport, were used to relocate physical archives and sensitive hard drives from facilities near Orenburg to more centralized locations. There was no official explanation. But those involved were given one clear instruction: do not use state communication networks for reporting. This level of compartmentalization is rarely deployed, and only under conditions where internal systems are believed to be compromised. On the streets, there was no mass unrest. But there was movement. Fuel demand in southern regions surged by nearly 18% in a single day. Purchases of generators, battery packs, bottled water, and long shelf-life goods spiked in retail chains from Saratov to Magnitogorsk. These behaviors were not driven by media coverage, there was none. They were driven by instinct, by an emerging collective understanding that official calm could no longer be trusted. This shift in public mood, unannounced but widespread, marks the beginning of a psychological migration, from passive acceptance to private contingency. And it is this migration, silent, decentralized, untraceable, that the Kremlin fears most. Not organized revolt. Not slogans. Not demonstrations. But the invisible withdrawal of belief. The quiet subtraction of emotional allegiance from a system whose legitimacy was always more performative than procedural. In diplomatic circles, the change was equally palpable. At least 3 European embassies submitted urgent requests for updated security assessments of energy infrastructure across Russia's interior regions. Turkish and Chinese observers, usually restrained in their analysis of domestic Russian security, issued unusually direct questions about facility redundancies and anti-sabotage protocols. These were not accusations. They were preparations, subtle indications that Russia's partners, though still publicly aligned, are now calculating the distance between formal alliance and operational risk. And in the private boardrooms of Moscow's elite, the reaction was sharper still. Several executives tied to state energy monopolies reportedly activated dormant exit strategies, legal vehicles, offshore holdings, dual citizenships. One senior figure in the oil transport sector was overheard during a closed meeting asking, "Is it the infrastructure thereafter? Or the illusion that it's protected?" It was not a rhetorical question. It was a strategic one, and its presence in the inner sanctums of power reveals a deeper rupture than any public protest could. What happened in Orenburg may, in military terms, be classified as a precision strike. But in the political vocabulary of authoritarian governance, it is something else entirely. It is a breach, not just of defenses, but of narrative containment. A demonstration that not only can the homeland be reached, but that no amount of orchestration, denial, or theatrical normalcy can put the flame back in the pipe once it's been lit. And so Russia enters a new phase. Not of war as spectacle, but of erosion. Erosion of perimeter. Erosion of belief. Erosion of the space between certainty and suspicion. Because after Orenburg, it is no longer a question of if the war reaches deeper into the heart of the state. The only question now is how far it's already inside.